In 1950, the United States entered a war. 36,000 Americans died. Over 1 million civilians were killed. The war lasted 3 years, and it never officially ended. Today, most Americans cannot tell you when it started, who the enemy was, or why their country fought it. This is the Korean War, and this is the story of how an entire conflict, fought by real soldiers, on real ground, with real consequences that persist to this day, was erased from the national memory. The question isn't just what happened in Korea between 1950 and 1953. The real question is, why does almost nobody talk about it? To understand the Korean War, you have to go back further than 1950. For 35 years, from 1910 to 1945, Korea was a Japanese colony. The Japanese imperial government suppressed Korean culture, forced Korean men into labor and military service, and systematically dismantled Korean national identity. Then, in August 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II was over, and Korea was suddenly free, but free into a world that had already made decisions about its future. At the end of the war, American and Soviet forces agreed to divide the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel, a line of latitude that cut roughly through the middle of the country. It was meant to be a temporary arrangement, a practical solution for accepting Japanese surrenders. The Soviets would handle the North. The Americans would handle the South. Nobody asked the Koreans. In the North, the Soviet Union installed a communist government under Kim Il-sung, a former guerrilla fighter and Soviet-trained military officer. In the South, the United States backed Syngman Rhee, a fiercely anti-communist Korean nationalist who had spent decades in exile. Both men claimed to represent all of Korea. Both men wanted the other gone. By 1948, there were 2 separate governments, 2 separate armies, and 2 separate visions for the Korean peninsula. The 38th parallel, originally a temporary line on a map, had become a border between 2 worlds. The only question was how long it would hold. Sunday, June 25, 1950, 4 in the morning. While most of South Korea slept, 75,000 soldiers of the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel. It was not a skirmish. It was not a provocation. It was a full-scale invasion, tanks rolling south, artillery opening up along a 150-mile front, coordinated and overwhelming. The South Korean army, poorly equipped and taken completely by surprise, collapsed almost immediately. Within 3 days, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, had fallen. In Washington, President Harry Truman received the news on a Saturday evening. He flew back to the White House immediately. The decision he faced was enormous. Intervene and risk a broader war with the Soviet Union and China, or stand aside and watch a communist government swallow an American-backed ally. Truman did not hesitate. "This is the Greece of the Far East," he told his advisers. "If we are tough enough now, if we stand up to them like we did in Greece 3 years ago, they won't take any next steps." The United States was going to war, not a declared war. Truman never asked Congress for a formal declaration. He called it a police action. But the men who would fight it knew exactly what it was. The early weeks of the war were desperate. American and South Korean forces were pushed back to a tiny perimeter around the port city of Busan, the southeastern corner of the peninsula. They held on, barely, as North Korean forces tried to push them into the sea. Then, on September 15, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched one of the most audacious military operations in American history, the Inchon landing. Against the advice of nearly every military planner who considered the harbor's tides, sea walls, and geography to be impossible obstacles, MacArthur landed 75,000 troops at Inchon, on the western coast of Korea, directly behind North Korean lines. It worked. Completely. Within 2 weeks, Seoul was recaptured. North Korean forces, their supply lines cut and their army surrounded, disintegrated. By October, American and South Korean troops had crossed back over the 38th parallel and were pushing north, all the way to the Yalu River, the border with China. The war seemed almost over. Then China entered. In late October 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, called volunteers by Beijing, crossed the Yalu River and slammed into American and South Korean forces. What followed was one of the most brutal military retreats in American history. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, November and December 1950. Temperatures dropped to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. 15,000 American Marines were surrounded by over 120,000 Chinese troops in the mountains of northeastern Korea. For 17 days they fought their way out. The Marines called it frozen Chosin. Weapons jammed in the cold. Men's fingers froze to their triggers. Morphine syrettes had to be thawed in medics' mouths before they could be injected. Of the 15,000 Marines who entered the Chosin Reservoir campaign, nearly 5,000 were casualties. They made it out. But the war had fundamentally changed. The front lines stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel, almost exactly where they had been before the war started. And there, for the next 2 years, they stayed. 15,000 men walked into those mountains. Not all of them walked out. If you've made it this far, you care about the stories that history forgot. That's exactly what this channel is about. Every week, we go back to the moments that shaped America. The ones that didn't make it into the textbooks. The ones too complicated for a headline. The ones that still matter today. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It takes 2 seconds. And the next story is worth it. To understand why the United States fought in Korea, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1950. 4 years earlier, World War II had ended. The Soviet Union had emerged as a global power. China had fallen to communist forces in 1949. The Soviets had tested their first nuclear bomb that same year. Washington was terrified. The guiding principle of American foreign policy at the time was containment. The idea, developed by diplomat George Kennan, that the United States had to prevent Soviet and communist influence from expanding anywhere in the world. Give up one country and the next would follow, the so-called domino theory. Korea fit directly into that logic. Truman also had the United Nations behind him. In an unusual stroke of luck, the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN Security Council at the time, protesting the exclusion of Communist China. Their absence meant the Security Council voted, without a Soviet veto, to authorize military force to defend South Korea. For the first time in history, an international military coalition was assembled under a UN flag. 16 nations sent troops. The United States provided the bulk of the forces and the commanding general. But soldiers from Britain, Canada, Australia, Turkey, France, and a dozen other countries fought and died in Korea alongside Americans. This was not a unilateral American war. It was, in the truest sense, the first war of the Cold War international order. By 1951, both sides knew they could not win. The front lines had solidified. Massive offensives brought tiny gains at enormous cost. The war had become a grinding, bloody stalemate. Peace negotiations began in July 1951. They would last 2 years. The main sticking point was a question that sounds almost bureaucratic, but was actually profound. What do you do with prisoners of war who don't want to go home? Thousands of North Korean and Chinese prisoners held in South Korea said they did not want to be repatriated. The communists insisted they had to be returned. The Americans refused to force them. This single issue extended the war and the killing by 2 years. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom, a village on the 38th parallel. Not a peace treaty, an armistice, a ceasefire agreement, a pause in hostilities. Technically, the Korean War never ended. The armistice established a demilitarized zone, the DMZ, running roughly along the 38th parallel, 2.5 miles wide on each side. It remains one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth, and the 2 Koreas that existed before the war still exist today. In almost exactly the same place. 3 years of war, millions of casualties, billions of dollars spent, and the map looked almost exactly the same as it had on June 24, 1950. So why don't we talk about it? Part of the answer is timing. The Korean War sits between 2 of the most culturally dominant conflicts in American history. World War II, the Great Moral Crusade, the Good War, the war of Tom Hanks movies and Greatest Generation mythology, and Vietnam, the war that tore America apart, spawned a generation of protest music, and produced 50 years of national guilt. Korea had neither the moral clarity of World War nor the cultural earthquake of Vietnam. It ended without victory, without surrender ceremonies, without a ticker-tape parade, just men coming home, quietly, to a country that had already moved on. There's another reason. The war was never declared by Congress. It had no formal beginning and no formal end. It existed in a kind of legal and political gray zone, a police action, in Truman's careful language, that made it easy to overlook in the history books. And then there is the simple, uncomfortable truth. America didn't win. Not clearly. Not in the way that mattered for national myth-making. The Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington was not dedicated until 1995, 42 years after the armistice. One of its inscriptions reads, "Our nation honors her sons and daughters who answered the call to defend a country they never knew and a people they never met. The men who fought there knew what they had done." The rest of America never quite caught up. The Korean War killed 36,000 Americans. Nearly 140,000 were wounded. Estimates of total casualties, Korean, Chinese, American, and from other nations, range from 1.2 to 1.5 million dead. The country those men fought to defend became one of the most remarkable economic success stories of the 20th century. South Korea today is a global technology powerhouse, a democracy of 51 million people, home to Samsung, Hyundai, and a cultural influence that reaches every corner of the world. North Korea, 60 miles away across the DMZ, is one of the most isolated and repressive regimes on Earth. The contrast is total, and it exists in part because of what those soldiers did in the mountains and rice paddies of a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. The war never officially ended. Right now, 28,500 American troops are still stationed in South Korea,